Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another, not a balance patch survey analysis because there hasn't been a balance patch, but I think with the inclusion of all the new cards, with Worlds around the corner, and with the meta being very talked about right now, and obviously being a very hot moment in Runeterra, I think it was appropriate to do an analysis of the balance in the game, although the patch isn't coming to October 20th because the devs, obviously, they don't normally patch a game once the new cards are released because the new cards will shake up the meta enough. But in this case, we haven't done a survey or a video like this one since I believe it was early June was the last enormous patch that they did. And obviously, Akshan came out. Sivir Akshan has been a thing for a long time. It got hotfixed recently, so a lot has happened in the game. We got the new expansion, but also Viego and that kind of mini expansion as well. So a lot has changed throughout the summer, and we are here to analyze the results of the Bandle City expansion survey analysis that we did. Well, I posted on Reddit on Monday. It is now Wednesday, and we are going to analyze it. And I'm joined, of course, once again, by one of the best competitive players in Runeterra, also turned caster now for EU Masters events, also a streamer and content creator, also a coach, and also the newest member of the most consistent podcast in Runeterra history, Progress Day. How are you, Lobster?
I'm doing great, man. I'm starting to feel like Khaleesi from Game of Thrones when you're starting to announce all of these titles. But yeah, it is a perfect timing to do this. Like you said, there hasn't been a really big balance patch, but the balance has shifted and been shaken up like crazy with the new cards that some of them have very high power levels, shape the meta in new ways. It's a great timing to talk about this.
And without further ado, let's just jump right into this quick transition to scene number 2. Wow, it's like magic. And we're going to talk about, obviously, the key points here are going to be the regional power level and that graph, regional thematic satisfaction, top 15 champions, the bottom 15 champions, controversial cards, and we'll be going over as well just all the champions in the Excel, the stylized Excel data sheet, just going through all the ones in the middle as well briefly to talk about everything. As usual, we'll have the graphs coming up here as we move along, and I haven't done the write-up on Reddit yet because it's quite early in the morning, as you can maybe tell by our faces, or not early in the morning, but in the morning at least. I'm not a morning person, so it'll be kind of more of a free-for-all. We'll try and spend a bit less time on thematic satisfaction because that was something that we kind of meandered on quite a bit in the past, and we'll try and keep this down to about 1 hour if possible. So without further ado, let's talk about first the general ratings for game balance and deck diversity. They're on the right-hand side. If you guys remember, the last time we did the survey, the ratings were like 1.5 point lowers. They were the lowest of the low ever in Runeterra's history, and that was with the Watcher and Thresh Nasus, Azir Aurelia, really dark times. And it was a kind of accumulation of darkness for 6 months. So obviously much better here. We'll talk about the power level and the game itself. So I think they're not going to go too much into this, just to keep it in mind. It's gone up by 1.5 since June. So generally people are much happier with the current meta and the current state of the game. So let's get this out of the way, and let's start off with regional power level. I'll quickly go over just what we're seeing here on the graph, and then we can dive into each different region. And this will be the graph that will be going kind of into each region more specifically than the thematic satisfaction. So to start things off, Bandle City, which is obviously the new region, the last region to be added to Runeterra, and it has a 3.97, which is very high. Looking at the past, maybe Shadow Isles Targon at some point was close or around this 4-point range, but generally it's not very often, and usually like 3.6 is where the highest ones are in what seems like a kind of balanced meta. So 3.90 for Bandle City and 3.80 for Noxus are definitely quite high. Then we have Shurima at 3.66. Has been a very strong region. Despite the recent hotfix nerfs, it's still, I think, very strong due to specific decks and champions that have been pretty dominant since their inclusion to the game. Then we have the more balanced area, the healthy area, with Piltover Zaun, Bilgewater coming out from the depths that it was in a few months ago to 3.21 again. Ionia, 3.18. Shadow Isles, 3.09. Probably one of the lowest points for Shadow Isles in the history of the game. It's never been the 6th region in terms of power level, always been in the top 3. So very, very surprising. Demacia 2.75. Again, a lot of those cards aren't really finding the right places. There are obviously Sivir Akshan and rally decks include Demacia and find success with it, but overall the deck diversity is quite low. And then Freljord, after the Watcher nerf, after Overwhelm not really being a thing with Sujani, it's really just Plunder and Thralls kind of doing work there, and a lot of other things have been kind of forgotten. Trundle, Braum, Vladimir, etc. And then Targon with the butchering, recent nerfs and stuff. It did go down quite a bit. It's quite played right now with Noizami, but Noizami. Fuck Mogwai, bro. He's really... it's just contagious. I'm serious. Any content creators do not work with Mogwai because he will inflict you with this champion mix-up. Zoe, Nami. Apart from that, it has fallen quite out of play, I think, in general. And we haven't seen, obviously, Invoke and Star Shaping and all that stuff got nerfed, so it doesn't really have a big place in the meta. With that out of the way, Lobster, now let's talk about Bandle City. What do you think about this region? What do you think about this being, the strongest region in the game right now, according to the community?
It's definitely an interesting one, and it does co-align with the, let's say, general notion in card games that new regions are always a bit stronger, always power crept at the beginning, maybe so that people do play the cards, so that there is interest in the region overall. It's still surprising a bit on the other side, because after only having been out for a few weeks, people should not have refined all of the decks yet. There should still be a lot of stuff that's unexplored in Bandle City, but nonetheless, it is topping the power ratings, even though by just a slim margin. I do think it's fairly well deserved, because there are a few real powerhouse cards in that region. One of them, arguably the strongest one, Bandle City Mayor, one of the newer engines that is fairly mana efficient and can, it serves for both a lot of value, even a potential infinite value chain with Mayor into Telescope into, I don't know, Howling Abyss or something. We've all had those moments. But at the same time, it's also a great tempo card, right? Because after you play 1 or 2 units, it already paid off for itself, but you can just keep on flooding the board very efficiently. And you can, especially if you run protection for the card, it's very efficient. And there are just a couple of examples of such cards that are both very good in tempo and mana efficient and can be played aggressively, but at the same time put stuff into your hand and therefore also give you options to play the long game.
Yeah, and the thing to look at here, let's talk about the archetypes and decks that are most prevalent. The cards we'll get into with the controversial card graph later on, and there are, spoiler, a lot of Bandle City cards in that graph, so it'll definitely be a topic we'll talk about. But as for the decks, I think the key one obviously is going to be the Bandle Tree deck, the different variations of it. It is very strong because it's able, like you mentioned with Mayor and just the way it plays out, able to put a lot of value on the board. And overall, there's so many decks that their game plan revolves obviously around playing on the board in the early to mid game, and decks that are built in a certain way, like Bandle Tree should be built with Bandle Tree as kind of a late game win condition. You have to play all these units, etc. Usually struggle in terms of surviving the early to mid game because they're not built around that to some extent. But this is where Bandle Tree obviously has little to no weaknesses. It has mini morph to answer late game stuff, and it just overall plays at a high power level throughout the entire game, while still being able to tech into Noxus and have Flock and have Scorched Earth and have versatile options. And when you have you're flooding the board with cheap units and have chump blockers, you don't need board control in terms of regions like Freljord with Avalanche, stuff like that. You don't need, there's just all these different things they kind of check mark, and I think it's why it's a very strong deck. It might not have the best matchup against a certain deck or so, but it has very good matchups against a lot of stuff and very versatile matchups. Mm-hmm. I think it's not very polarized, which is why it's been a big thing.
I agree. Versatility is the keyword here, and that also explains that it's not only Bandle Tree as a more control-ish deck, but there's also Poppy Lulu or different versions of Poppy Rally that are more aggressive. You can also splash Bandle City into the Darkness archetype for a full-on control deck. Like, a lot of those cards can be played at different paces. And another reason for this is that there are just multiple staple cards in that region that are very mana efficient. We get into those later, but yeah, I mentioned Mayor, Pokey Stick, Hidden Pathways, all of those are so mana efficient and so versatile that you can play them in any type of deck at any speed.
And this is something that comes with, we saw it with Targon, we saw it with Shurima, and we saw it now with Bandle City. The devs, intentionally or not, when a new region comes out, it is, there is power creep. The cards are especially powerful. Can this be intentional? Yes, because maybe the devs obviously want players to playtest the new cards. They want players to build new decks, and then they can adjust accordingly, like we've seen now with Shurima, we saw with Targon, maybe with a bit too much delay on some of the changes for both of those regions. Maybe for this one, they've learned their lesson, and it would be quicker to adjust things that need adjusting, because I think some things might be obvious, others not so much, I think. But definitely the power level overall with the region, and as we picked the five for the poll itself, we had a very easy time, just boom, 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 boom. These are the 5, and they're all pretty broken. And even the 6th card, Loping Telescope, was not included because there wasn't space for 6. Although I should have probably made an exception like I had with Shurima in the past to include it, because I think it's also on the same power level. And these cards are not necessarily meta warping or broken. It's just a little bit of power creep, a little bit of kind of Merciless Hunter, where it's just, too much, and they're doing too much and too easily and too cheaply across the board, not just for one card, but just the entire deck has too many things going well for it. And it's going to be obviously a very high play rate deck and pretty meta warping as well. Going on to Noxus. I think that's all. Actually, we can talk about Darkness a little bit for Bandle City, because it's also obviously part of the Bandle package with Shadow Isles and Vhagar. It is a new control deck. It is powerful, and it's what in the matchups that a control deck looks for. But overall, I think we can both agree it's not really a super meta-defining deck in a tournament standpoint, and it has its weaknesses, obviously, because it's very specifically strong against certain things, but then has a lot of weaknesses that most control decks like it have before, and things like edge row control and things that just bank on just removing things for value, and when there's nothing to remove or the matchup's a bit more weird or different, they have a hard time with that.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is a very high skill cap deck as well. Most of the lines are not that easy to see. Therefore, I think it might make some splashes in high ladder finishes and sometimes in tournaments, but it's never going to dominate the meta. It's always just going to be more of an answer to the meta if there is room for one of those efficient control decks that does lack some early game consistency, though.
And then also Metal City, we have less meta defining decks, but decks nonetheless. We have Teemo Caitlyn, which is not going to be obviously a tournament deck, or at least not a stable tournament deck, but in the same way that there were players that decided to bring Puff Cap Foundry decks in the past and had certain matchups and certain lineups that it would fit in. I think Teemo Caitlyn, in a similar vein, against certain control decks that are not really playing, that don't have life steal or life gain, that are trying to play a long game, they're going to get wrecked by shrooms. It's you can't stop that eventuality from happening, and it might be a similar thing here. Not a meta-defining deck, but definitely a deck that exists in Runeterra now, and a deck that can be considered in certain specific situations in a tournament lineup or even on ladder with certain metas as well. And Fizz Vi, maybe a similar situation.
It's a good point that you bring them up, though, because those decks have not been explored that much yet. First of all, the people just try to look for the new meta definers for what are just the strongest deck in a vacuum. And once those are established, people will start looking for potential answers for weaknesses in those meta definers. And there might be more answers to that in the Bandle City pool of cards that we already have. You're giving it the best shot at finding some of those. And yeah, with some success, there might be more to come.
It's a tough job, but someone's got to do it. Someone's got to wade through the treasured trash and find the hidden gems. Those are the two decks. I've also recently been playing an Ezreal Vi Shellfolk deck. I think Curious Shellfolk is a card that definitely can be explored more. We saw in Fight Night last week with Zillion. I think it was Broken Ball that brought it, and Bulasha brought a version with Vi as well. So it's a card that, there are interesting cards in Bandle City apart from the meta ones, and I think it's definitely something you can explore in the future. Moving on to Noxus, also a very strong region right now. We have, of course, it's included as part of Bandle City as kind of now the preferred region, I think, the most optimal region in terms of Scorched Earth and Flock being possibilities. We have also, of course, Draven Sion is the biggest, I think, or the most effective deck on that ladder right now, and the highest play rate, and I think tied with Darkness or so, and overall just a very strong tournament deck as well. We have Draven Caitlyn, Draven Ezreal, discard aggro to some extent with Jinx still. Anything I'm missing from Noxus?
Those are definitely the most prominent. I guess some hipsters try to counter the meta with Swain decks and that kind of stuff. But yeah, the most prominent ones are definitely a mixture of the new additions that are very, very strong for the new cards that came in, like Lost Soul, like Sion. Parts of the discard package, like Fallen Rider, are pretty insane, to be quite honest. A mixture of those paired with the old cards that were already super duper efficient. Ravenous Flock is the most obvious example. Even a lot of Sion discard decks start splashing 2 copies of Flock, 2 copies of Sentry for a bit more mid-game control and optionality. Maybe a copy of or 2 of Scorched Earth. It's very versatile, good in the meta right now because of Bandle Tree decks, a potential removal for Nami, but also options to kill off your own Sion to get the rally when you need it, when you want it. And it makes sense, even though that Noxus did not get a high quantity of new cards. The quality of them, super high, and it makes sense that Noxus is just more or less on top of the regional power level.
Yeah, essentially one of the cards that you mentioned that has been, not touched, and maybe it's not unbalanced, but it's very strong in terms of what it can do as a 3-drop flock as well, like you mentioned. Then of course you have the aggro slant as well, with discard aggro, with spiders to some extent, with pirate aggro. These are still decks that are efficient at what they do, and most of the cards haven't been changed in terms of just the burn plan and the early drops, rear guard, etc., have all still been unchanged for a long time and are still very, very viable in that strategy. So not surprised to see Noxus this high. It is the highest it's ever been. That is true. Spoiler, Draven is also the highest he's ever been in the top 15 champion rating. Very surprising, but my boy is finally making it to the top. He hasn't been changed for a long time, and he has been a staple part of the meta on ladder and in tournaments for a long time as well. So maybe finally, this Sion coming in and putting him very much in the spotlight, we'll maybe finally get to see some Draven nerfs, because he has been around for a very long time in the same state as well. Moving on to Shurima, we have obviously there's still, despite the Sivir nerfs, or the nerfs to the Sivir Akshan deck, Akshan's a very strong champion still. The deck with Demacia in tournaments still plays out very well. And then we have Azir got nerfed, and I think nerfed enough that now it's going to really see a lot less play rate and not really be a viable option, but still exists as an archetype. We have Lurk kind of as a comfort pick for some players, and still a very strong deck in the right hands if you know how to play it. Turbo Thralls, Zillion came in as a new meta definer. Talia as well, with Ziggs possibly. So overall, I think the region is in a strong place, but overall, I think a good place as well, especially with the recent nerfs to Shapestone and Merciless Hunter. I think now it's kind of like where Shadow Isles always used to be, like very strong power level, feels good, a lot of deck diversity, but not necessarily, I think, too strong in any format.
I agree. I think it's not completely overtuned or game breaking anymore, which was maybe the case with the previous Sivir package and the Azir package. More well-rounded, more versatility. I'm almost a bit surprised to see the power level perception be that high, because I think a lot of these newer landmark decks and so on are not quite on the right power level to compete in the meta for a long time. Part of the reason might be that people just played it a lot in the first couple of days of the expansion against subpar decks, against non-optimized decks, and felt like something like Zillion was pretty strong. And it's an all-right deck, but I do agree with your final statement, absolutely. A lot of okay decks, a lot of playable decks. None of them are really overtuned, though. A good place to be in for a region.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, I think generally with... I guess there's also, I think with Shurima especially, the region when it came out initially, it had a few very broken cards, but overall the region was either very strong or very weak. And we'll talk about it later with Thematic Satisfaction, briefly talking about how the game feels and how the regions feel in like a bigger picture. But quickly to say that I think now with this latest expansion with Bandle City, a lot of old archetypes were really filled out completely and really have now all the tools they were supposed to have. Initially with the initial launch of the region and those archetypes, I think with landmarks, with Xerath, now a lot of things make so much more sense. So many cards that were never played are now seeing a lot of play because they finally fit into an archetype fully. With Talia as well, I think this expansion really, there was so many sub-archetypes that weren't fully fleshed out that now have been completed, and Shurima is one of the regions that benefited the most from this happening. Bilgewater, I think, as well to some extent.
Yeah, I agree. I can't really add anything more. I think we can move over to Piltover and Zaun.
Let's move over to Piltover and Zaun. Of course, a region that's paired a lot with Noxus. So a lot of the same things we said about Noxus with Draven Sion, Draven Caitlyn, Draven Ezreal are all part of this. A region that's also paired with Teemo. We mentioned Bandle City as well, and paired with Bandle City as well to some extent with Fizzvi and all those decks. Everything that has to do with Karma Ezreal, for example. Is also the old Foundry deck is all part of PNC as well. And overall, Piltover and Zaun in the past 6 months has really, I think, evolved. 6 to 8 months from this place where all the cards were really bad. It was like Ezreal and removal spells, and that was it. Nothing else was even remotely playable. There's still things like Heimerdinger that aren't, but overall, so many new cards were added that really fleshed out, the region as a whole. Same with Shurima, I think. And again, I think it's in a similar place where it's feels good. Deck diversity is good. Cards feel good. Champions feel good. They all have a home to some extent, except for Heimerdinger and maybe Vi in some places. or in some people's opinions. But overall, I think it's definitely in a good place.
Yeah, PNZ got some interesting new additions in the form of Caitlyn and the trap package. Most of all, Sting Officer, Karina Mastermind, one of the higher power level cards in the right deck. Just more versatility to archetypes and to deck building options that you have. Expanding the traps archetype, the Teemo archetype, and so on. Therefore, yeah, nothing that's really overtuned or broken, but some solid staple cards. Caitlyn as a 3-mana 3/3 quick attack, just being solid regardless if you go all in on the traps or not. And that also gives you more deck building options, like, for example, splashing Caitlyn in the Draven Caitlyn deck without further trap synergy.
Yeah, like you mentioned with, again, with Shurima, the same thing that, landmark archetype, etc. The mushroom archetype is now finally not just this meme with Peddler and Freljord trying to stall things out till someone dies of boredom, but it's actually something that has a finisher now with Karina Mastermind, and again, another sub-archetype that has never been, one of these key archetypes in Runeterra, but now finally does feel like one, and now you can finally say, oh, this is how this deck should have been from the beginning, and this is how the deck now feels complete. There's no random cards added to just fill up slots. It's now every single card has, a purpose, like Leshing Yordle as well, etc. Do make it seem like it's fully fleshed out now, and like you mentioned, new cards like Station Archivist, Time Trick, obviously that got added a little while ago, but cards that I think fit PNZ's role of like this, this kind of, not, the value isn't just in units and on the board and removal spells it was before, but it has a bit more kind of abstract value in terms of what you can do and these different possibilities that I think are quite nice.
And not always just the same staple cards. Like, it used to be Mystic Shot in every deck, and like what Static Shock was very popular for a long time. Ezreal used to be in almost any PNZ deck, Thermal Beam, but now, just more options, more versatility. Yeah, and I think that's all we can say for PNZ, right?
Yeah. Moving on to Bilgewater. Bilgewater had, as you guys can imagine or remember, before the revert to make it rain, a lot of problems. It was kind of where Targon is right now. Very, very low in play rate, 3% play rate on ladder, and just overall a very forgotten archetype after the, again, kind of similar to Targon, the butchering of Twisted Fates, Make It Rain. Over the course of those few months, made it, plunder, all that was just not very appealing. And then obviously the very precise and very, I know you're going to be against this, but I think the necessary revert to Make It Rain opened up so many archetypes to come back in. Plunder has come back in very strongly, almost single-handedly because of Make It Rain and Monster Harpoon as at least the reason for people to play it. And then it was maybe already very good, but just didn't have a reason to play it, and this incentivized people to do so. And it became, again, a staple. And we have obviously Nami coming in with Bilgewater, Shelley coming in with Bilgewater, two very, very strong cards in a vacuum that have reawakened parts of the Bilgewater identity, although it's mainly kind of Targon, aside from the champion and Shelley, but two very strong cards as well in the current format.
Absolutely. Generally speaking, like power level wise, I'm with you. Make It Rain change is great for Bilgewater. Of course, I do have some issues with the RNG behind the card, but that's a different story. I think Bilgewater found a nice place, except for the Nami and Shelley package, and I think we'll get to that later on. Kind of similar to PNZ, they had not too many new cards, but some interesting new cards. I just feel like for Bilgewater, those new cards are a bit overtuned. Therefore, I'm almost a bit surprised that it's in the exact middle of these power rankings. I suppose aside from the Nami Shelley deck and to some extent the Plunder deck, we don't see much play of Bilgewater, and that might explain why a lot of people don't really perceive it as a very strong region, because Zoe Nami needs to be played very well and is more dominant in the highest levels of play in tournaments and at the top of the ladder. And until like Platinum, I think it's not going to see as much play, and it's not going to look as strong as if you play against it, if people don't pilot it close to perfection.
Yeah, and I also agree that I think most decks that do have Bilgewater as a secondary region, or even as a first region, they maybe don't feel like Bilgewater decks, if that makes sense. So people don't perceive it as, I think the region identity has been not lost, but it's not as obvious, I think, when you're playing against kind of like TF Swain, for example, feels more like Swain, I think, to some extent, feels more like Noxus. TFGP, obviously that is fully Bilgewater, but it's not really as played. Lurk doesn't really, you don't associate Lurk with Bilgewater. It's more Shurima and more like the Rek'Sai package, although Pyke is in it, of course, and Bone Skewer, but I think it's like the identity is a bit mixed up, so people might have some trouble associating certain decks like you're mentioning, and the deck diversity maybe isn't as high as the other top regions, although some of the top decks, like you mentioned, are very high. with Plunder and Zoe Nami.
That's a good call. Bilgewater feels like a supporting region in most decks. Whenever you play the more control-y package of Bilgewater, you usually want to pair it with Noxus, for example, for Flock and Scorched Earth and so on. Even in Go Hard, it's mostly the deck is built around Shadow Isles cards like Go Hard. Bilgewater is support for a lot of draw and cheap stuff. Therefore, yeah, it's a lot of decks plays Bilge as the secondary region. Targon Zoe Nami also feels like a Targon deck for sure. Just Plunder is the only one that's really full on Bilgewater, and that does not see quite as much play anymore.
And even then, with Plunder, I just feel like Sejuani is the key.
Sejuani,
like you see the freezes, and I associate it more with Freljord, for not really with Bilgewater, even though it's an Allegiance deck with 37 Bilgewater cards. But I don't know. I think the identity has been a bit lost with TF not being a staple, with Nab not really being the key part of the Plunder deck, for example. Like, it is a bit different, I think, in that regard. And Scouts is also, I guess, a deck to mention, but it does feel more just like board Demacia, mid-range, not so much Bilgewater doing anything, even though Misfortune is from Bilgewater. So yeah, some confusion there, I think, in the identity in the minds of the community to some extent, and I think it's normal as well. It's to be expected. Moving on to Ionia. Obviously, we had Sivir Akshan with Ionia. Initially, we had Azir Aurelia. Initially, we had... One second, I'm just opening up just to have the decks to look at the meta decks. We have, obviously, Rally decks with Lulu Zed, and then Lulu Poppy. We have Shen Jarvan to some extent still being a thing. Karma Ezreal with Ionia, with Karma, of course, as well. And Lee Zoe, not so much with this new expansion, but I think that pretty much covers most of Ionia right now.
Maybe our boy Viego deserves a shout out as well, even though low play rate.
Yeah. We'll talk about Viego later because it's interesting. I didn't play the deck too much. I wasn't playing too much during that kind of release of that champion in that month or so during the summer. So I don't have that impression in my mind of Viego being a meta staple or a meta kind of just like a forgotten kind of dude, even though he's kind of strong and the decks did find some success. But yeah, Viego Ionia was definitely a list that saw some play during its time before Bandle City kind of overshadowed it, I think.
Yeah. Even though Ionia, I think Ionia actually feels like it's in a good place right now. Of course, some of the cards are much stronger than others, and I think we'll see that with Ionia and Demacia. For Ionia, certain cards like Twin Disciplines and Young Witch sees it play in a lot of decks, and are a major part of the region of the reason why this region is playable in the first place, and why it's being splashed into decks like Shen Jarvan or Lulu Zed Rally. That being said, like, none of the cards is really broken or overtuned. There's just some strong staple cards, and I feel like the rest of the region, at least now after the Sivir Akshan Ionia nerfs, I think the rest of the region is also more streamlined and fairly balanced.
I think like you mentioned before, or like I mentioned before with PNZ, I think Ionia is kind of where PNZ used to be to some extent, with, again, not so much diversity in terms of the cards you can build with, because cards like Twin Disciplines, Eye of the Dragon, Young Witch, Concussive Palm, etc. are just so much stronger than every other option in terms of just a vacuum power level. So the deck building is just very centered around these cards, and I think you can talk about Ionia and Demacia together because both regions are being held together by Rally and by Combat Tricks with Ionia, and that mixture, which has been around since Fiora Shen, but has changed its speed from mid-range to tempo to with Shen Jarvan maybe more control-y a little bit later state of the game, but still very similar stuff happening with those two region combos. And both regions here, but also in thematic satisfaction, are going to rank lower than average, I think, and definitely something can be done to fix them to some extent. The nerf to Dancing Droplet, I think, still was a mistake. And I still think, especially now after Azir Aurelia has been nerfed so much, that nerf can be reverted and would open up more elusive possibilities, more fully elusive decks, not rally decks, more things with the Ionia Allegiance card as well, for example. So that's something to look at in terms of making more things viable. And the recall package with Azir Aurelia being nerfed and Dancing Droplet being nerfed has also, again, gone out of play, and you can't really play, it's just not as viable. It's not really an option to play a deck that goes into Homecoming and to, Nowhere Conspirator. Bouncing things and getting value from that doesn't exist. There's nothing you bounce really in the game now that gets you value with Dancing Droplet nerfed. So definitely a card that I applauded and loved when it released, And again, I hate now that it's been nerfed because I think it was pivotal, like Ballistic Bot and PNZ, in opening up many archetypes in the region.
Yeah, I agree with you on that take, and it does feel like Otterpus is just the new dancing droplet of a different region, and it does have the tune and everything.
Yeah.
One thing about dancing droplet though is I think it is a bit harder to design cards around it in the future because that card can go infinite compared to Otterpus, for example, because of the repeatability of the card draw effect. So maybe they had something like that in mind, like future card design. But I do agree, like right now, I think if droplets that had a tune, there would be a lot more interesting deck options.
And it's, again, there needs to be a card that gives you a payoff for recalling. I think that's the biggest thing. You know, Yasuo has recall in his packages, not just stun. Like, this archetype or this sub-archetype has been lost for the entirety of Runeterra's cycle. It saw some. I was playing an elusive deck that had Dancing Droplet and Conspirator and Homecoming with the Allegiance card, and it would bring out, I think, Teemo and something, and you know, just an elusive deck and it worked. It won games in Diamond and Masters, and it's not going to be meta stable, but the archetype exists at least the same way that Teemo archetypes now exist and feel fleshed out and refined. And this entire recall package is completely, and hand buff, I guess, to some extent, is completely, again, non-existent. There's cards like Jewel Protector and certain hand buff cards that don't do anything in the game right now, aside from some niche interactions with Zed and you know, some inclusions in those decks. But overall, I think Ionia is definitely a region that has to be fleshed out in the future, and is currently in the state that PNZ used to be in the past, where, you know, it can be fixed. There's many cards that are not playable that have to be fixed. And if they do another big balance trial like they did in June, I think a lot of Ionia cards might be looked at to kind of even out the power level in the region itself.
Yeah, I'm with you. Some of those packages of Ionia can definitely deserve some love. But going back to what we mentioned earlier on, the comparison with Demacia, because I think, yeah, they're kind of similar in regards to this regional power level. Demacia also being centered around certain cards. Sharpside has like a 90-something% play rate across all Demacia decks. So an auto 3-of include in everything. And then Demacia does see play in a lot of high-level decks, but only because of certain splash cards, only because of the rally cards, because of Brightsteel Protector, because of Sharpside, and arguably like Ranger's Resolve, Concerted Strikes Against Combat type of things. Therefore, it's always the same couple of cards, and I think that led to the fact that Demacia's power level is seen as low, similar to Bilgewater, that is often a supporting region. Another reason might be one of the strongest new Demacia cards, Poppy, is also a Bandle City card. So maybe people perceive Poppy as Bandle and not Demacia. So it's a bit hard to really interpret these numbers regarding multi-region cards. But yeah, Demacia definitely the same issues as Ionia. Centered around the top cards. Everything else is, yeah, let's say below average.
Yeah, I completely agree. Both regions are, I think, identical in their problems and in their, again, some options being very, very strong. So just auto-include in every archetype, even if the archetype doesn't necessarily need these cards. Things like you mentioned, stables like Concerted Strike, I think especially with Sivir Akshan now is really, that's a deck that's really breaking some of these cards that have this very specific interaction with Spell Shield, with Quick Attack units, Cataclysm to some extent, and rally effects obviously have been a problem since the very first, elusive rally decks that, the first genius in the closed beta that decided to add rally to these elusive decks. And then I added in and other players added in, and people started seeing how broken this spell was in certain situations with certain boards and how strong of an effect it was for 3 mana. Then Golden Aegis came out, and suddenly it's not just that it's consistent, but now every single rally deck on turns 4 and 5, you never think he doesn't have rally. You're always playing around the card because there's just a much higher chance they have it in hand, and that makes it so much worse for a card like that one, where it's kind of situational and you have to have it in hand and all this, and now it's more consistent to have it. And yeah, like you mentioned, because these cards are so strong, they make other archetypes, other champions, Garen, Shyvana now as well, with Targon being, with the nerfs to the Fangs and all these other cards. They're cards that you don't even consider trying to build or play around because, one, they're fairly vanilla. Demacia as a region is fairly vanilla. So there's even less incentive for people to try and deck build different things, because why would you play Garen and his rally effect on a level up when you just have rally and Golden Aegis and Relentless Pursuit for 3 and 4 mana? Why would you play Shyvana when you have better units? Why would you play Shenjarvan even when you can just end the game on turn 5 instead? Brightsteel Protector it's been a card that I will continue to put on the spotlight alongside I Have a Dragon as cards that have been, they're not the most like especially with Breastplate Protector, it's not the most exciting card. It's not the card that they play and like, oh shit, nah, Breastplate Protector really ruined my game now. But it's a card that you're gonna attack, you have a big swing, and they play Breastplate Protector, and they play a barrier for 0 mana on a well-statted 2-drop, and you're fucked. And it really doesn't. It's not flashy how it kind of warps the turns and certain matchups, but it's a card that has a very big impact, even though it's not as intuitive. The same with Eye of the Dragon, although that one's a bit more obvious, but definitely cards that have to be looked at, and they have to do kind of a region. It's not just the power level in terms of in the meta, it's the power level within itself is a problem, I think, for both of those regions.
I mean, I think it's good that these cards do get continued attention and that you keep shouting them out, because these cards are also defined by getting better as new cards are being added. Yeah. So they're kind of supporting cards, and if the other synergistic cards get better, then these cards improve as well. Draven is another great example, but also Eye of the Dragon and Brightstate Protector. The more important the units are that you can protect, the better Brightstate Protector is. And the same can be said about the Eye of the Dragon. The easier it is to get access to cheap spells and efficient cheap spells, the better the card is. So even though like many cards fall behind if the average power level rises, these cards might even rise with them or surpass the other ones, and while at the same time making these new cards better.
Yeah, definitely. I think two regions that have to be looked at in terms of power level and in terms of just their identity and the satisfaction deck diversity. Definitely, I think, somewhat problematic. Let's look now at Shadow Isles, which is wedged between both of these. Again, the product of a lot of nerfs that have really kind of slowly changed a lot of staple cards that have really reduced the power level quite a bit. I think Stalking Shadows especially is yet another, I think mistake in terms of the amount of deck diversity that nerf reduced in Shadow Isles. Regardless of the card being strong or not, these enabler cards that really create archetypes to some extent. Now, Chariot Sumpwork doesn't make sense in any, as a deck at all. Which it wasn't a stable deck before, but now because Stalking Shadows got nerfed, this card ceases to exist, in my opinion. Nightfall ceases to exist, in my opinion. Nocturne, Diana, continually low play rate, and Stalking Shadows didn't help. Deep to some extent, some lists were running Stalking Shadows, also got hit by this. It was just a staple deck building card in Shadow Isles, and that nerf, I think, really didn't help with just the power level. And overall, not many strong cards have been added to Shadow Isles. The staple good cards have always been the same ones, the same removal tools, Vile Feast, Withering Whale. Some new cards got added and some, but overall, I think it doesn't feel like the region has really evolved past its old identity and its old decks that were in the past, while everything else has come in power crept, has come in stronger. Shurima, Bandle City, even Noxus have come in with much newer and stronger deck archetypes, where Shadow Isles has remained in the past, and now we're seeing it, the effects of that in the power level rating.
Shadow Isles is interesting because I feel like the identity of the control archetypes in general have completely been revamped. Right now, all of the Freljord Shadow Isles control, which has been around since day one, is barely playable anymore because the fast decks are too fast. Your removal is not efficient enough. So we have a new type of control that has emerged, something like Darkness Control, that has a lot of early units as well and has a lot of value generation and small targeted removal, or a medium-sized targeted removal. And therefore, a lot of these old cards have fallen out of consideration when building decks, especially towards the control archetypes, I feel like. But you're right that the aggro archetypes got hit in a similar way. There's just better aggro options right now. Also, because there's so much effective removal in all of these Noxus deck and board control, the SI aggro package cannot really keep up anymore. Yeah. And I mean, I get the sentiment behind the Stalking Shadows nerf. They did print cards like that 4-mana 3/3 that deals 3 to your opponent's Nexus. I don't remember the name. Astral Fox or something.
Astral Fox. Yeah, pretty precise guess for not remembering the name.
Fair. But so like, there was the potential that some of those interactions might have been overtuned, and people have been complaining about SI aggro like for a long time. But I think Stalking Shadows might be one of those changes that could be reverted at some point in the future, like realizing that as of right now, SI aggro just isn't prevalent at all.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, I think even now control decks are moving away from the idea of trying to remove and control everything in the early and mid game and just playing a board chump blocking strategy with Bandle City now, with certain things that the most viable way of now controlling the board is not through removal spells, because things like Withering Wail, like you mentioned, have been outclassed by things like Mayor just spewing out a ton of like too much board tempo too quickly. Before it used to be House Spider you were worried about, now it's a lot more than that. And things like even the go hard did a similar thing. They flooded the board early to control the early and mid game, not with spells, not with, obviously they had go hard still and they had some removal spells, but they stopped playing Withering Wail, stopped playing, those kind of board centric strategies just to flood the board with their own chump blockers and to survive that way. Same with Deep. Deep started playing Ski Scarab and units instead of Withering Wail because, for the same thing, because it just wasn't as effective or efficient in removal, and there was too many different, I think, early to mid game board scenarios that you couldn't consistently answer with just a fully spell removal package. Maybe Freljord with Avalanche and Light Ravine was the only way to do it, but not with Shadow Owls by itself, and not with Shadow Owls paired with like PNZ, for example. There have been new things added, like Catalog of Regrets, and Go Hard is now coming back into the thing. And I think maybe there's some exploration to do with Shadow Owls, but overall, I think it's fair to say it's been outclassed on many different metrics. And what was always a staple, an emblematic region in terms of power level and deck diversity and satisfaction, has for one reason or another, power creep or certain cards being nerfed, found itself now 6th in the slots and in the ratings here. And that's not something that's good for the game, I think, because people were very happy with Shadow Owls, with the playing the certain decks. The thematic satisfaction was always very high and still is, I think, to some extent. So I think it's never going to be a good thing for Shadow Owls to be a bad region. I think its benefits more be kind of in the middling areas, or at least, or maybe even above average.
Mm-hmm. Although I will say I think Shadow Isles is not too bad, both in satisfaction as well as power level. And it used to be, like, many people perceived the high roll aggro curse as frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that not being quite as strong anymore as with like Thresh Nasus times is not necessarily a bad thing. But yeah, it has a bit of catching up to do.
But I mean, Bandle City is still now doing the same thing in terms of flooding the board very quickly, and you can have your own normal units, let's say your fair units and your fair spells, but you're still getting hit for 4 or 5 extra damage on the wideness of their boards on turns 3, 4, 5, and 6, and then that's why you're losing to Poppy when she comes down, and etc., because you're taking too much damage. So Bandle City doing some of the same things that used to be done in Shadow Walls in terms of Curse Keeper and flooding the board very quickly, but with a different combo in a different way, and maybe a less flashy way, but still I think just as effective.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting analogy. I do think Bandle City is a bit more interactable because once you shoot out or snipe out the mayor, their tactic crumbles a bit, and it's a bit different having like staring at a little board of very white creatures and then like having turn 2 or turn 3 the 10 damage high rolls, if you remember those, like Bark Piece, Butcher, Curse Keeper. But yeah, I think we can move on to the 2 regions that got the least love on this Bandle City expansion so far. Freljord coming up next.
Yeah, Freljord, no new champions in this new region, or this new drop, let's say. No new champions with the Viego Akshan release either, if I recall correctly. The last new champion was Lissandra. Mm-hmm. Lissandra got nerfed appropriately, and I think the Watcher is, in its rightful place, not being played. But overall, there hasn't been, I think, a substituting way to end the game with a control shell like Trundle Lissandra, for example, or Lissandra with whatever other combo. In that, Shadow Owls Freljord combo, Anivia exists, but Anivia is kind of, old and boring probably for most people. They don't even want to consider it. And the rest of the decks, it's a supporting region. I guess with Puff Caps, maybe with Foundry, it's still kind of the main thing with freezes and stuff. But overall, and with Thralls, I guess to some extent, but it doesn't really, other than that, Plunder, supporting region with Sejuani. Sejuani is one of the very good things about Freljord right now. Strong, maybe above average, but definitely not, I think, game breaking, but definitely feels good. But that's, of course, more Bilgewater deck building. And Swain Sejuani, I played a bit of it, and I think it has an interesting place, but the dish of the decks in the meta has gone so the power creep is really affected. Again, talking about kind of clean removal with Avalanche and stuff. Just the tempo, you're able to reflood the board with certain things. With Sion and Draven, how you're able to get this ephemeral and Boom Baboon and the drag you out of the way even after you've Avalanche, for example. It just feels like, again, they've been outclassed a bit, and removal as a whole, especially AoE removal, isn't really as valuable in the current meta. And Yeah, overall, Freljord just feels a bit outclassed. And again, I think this is a key thing is not having a new champion, not having that many new cards being added in. The cards that were added in were more like the Yeti package and all this, were maybe more meme centric, although I think there may be some exploration still to be done there. Overall, just feels like it's been, like Shadow Owls used to be a dominant, very strong region, but has been a bit outclassed in the recent months.
I agree with you. Like many of the core mechanics of Freljord don't have a place in the current meta, really. Like the whole freeze archetype. Freljord used to excel at mid-rangey and like being the king of mid-range archetypes, basically, with Ashe. And like Ashe can't quite keep up with the fast board-centric decks anymore, I feel like. Ashe is a bit too slow at developing their own units or removing opponents' units. And cards like Culling Strike and so on are not, as a splash card in many of those Freljord decks, are not very reliable anymore because there's Sharp Sides, there's Nami buffing units to infinity super quickly, Twin Disciplines and so on, Shaped Stone, you name it. Freljord can't deal with all of the threats effectively enough anymore, whether it is through board control like Avalanche Blighted Ravine, or whether it is through board control through mid-range units. It's just fallen behind. Not much new things added. I do agree Thralls is probably the only real Freljord deck that still sees play and has an effective finisher in Thralls, not even in Lissandra.
And also comparing to PNZ in the past, I think it has just a lot of cards that cannot see play, that are just complete memes. So many of these ramp cards and the Plunder Wolf dude that gives you an extra gem. So many like these slow speed vulnerable and freezing, like just these like open beta or like initial base set launch of the game that have been completely outclassed and are in need of like a revamp or a change or like a.
And many of Freljord's win conditions were only win conditions because of, let's say, like a lower amount of interaction in the meta. Because now that Minimorph and Stress Defense and Hush and everything exists, a card like Battle Fury is so much worse. The Overwhelm keyword is going to be so much less consistent at closing out games. It just, Freljord couldn't keep up with how the other regions evolved.
And the things that were added, like the Sandra got nerfed, the Watcher, I think that was necessary. Thralls is, like you mentioned, the one good thing I think that came out, but everything else, like Shadow Owls, I think feels like Bled Ravine also, very big staple card, and maybe Ice Shard to some extent. But overall, just a large amount of the Freljord pool of cards just haven't have 0.001% play rate, and it's for a reason. I think like a few regions got changed with the June patch where there's these 20 or 30 changes. Something like this, focusing on Freljord, Ionia and Demacia, could really benefit the game a lot. But I think that's it for Freljord. Let's move on to the last region, which is Targon, which is... it did get obviously butchered to some extent with Star Shaping, with the Fangs, with Serpent, with Aphelios, obviously a bit later, more behind, getting nerfed. And these are staple cards and key cards in the region. The problem with these nerfs is that other cards in the region did not get buffed. So it's like if you go into Demacia or Ionia and nerf all these cards we talked about being these cards that kind of choke out the diversity in the region, and you don't buff everything else, then the region will fall to where Targon is now, with maybe one champion or one combination with Nami Zoe being very strong and very playable. But really, that is it. I guess Tomka and Soraka in like a tournament setting also has very specific polarized matchups that it can do well in and make sense in the lineup. But overall, it's a region that, again, you nerfed it to the ground like Bilgewater. In the past, this is kind of Bilgewater 3 months or 4 months later. It's going to follow the same cycle. And I think maybe some reverts will happen, like Make It Rain revert, and maybe some new cards will be added that make sense and make it viable. And then decks like Taric and decks like, Invoke decks and Aurelion Soul decks will come back into the meta with, again, once cards were nerfed, other cards should have been buffed to compensate to keep the region level. Maybe not as strong as it was, but, somewhere in the middle. I think that was the biggest mistake with Targon.
What stands out about Targon for me is that it's always the same package being played across all of the decks that are viable. It's like Guiding Touch, Pale Cascade, those key cards that are efficient, but everything else is kind of, again, cannot keep up the whole Invoke package. And it is interesting, you mentioned it yourself, like Targon is part of probably the strongest deck in the game right now in Zoe Nami, and yet has by far the lowest score in the power level ratings, and we'll get to the thematic satisfaction ratings as well. Kind of reminds me of Demacia and Ionia. It's a bit of a supporting region rather. yeah, TK Raka, I also want to add Zoe Lee as the third deck that does he play. But again, it's usually just the same couple of cards that he play. They are used for very similar purposes, cheap spell triggers, a lot of cycling and so on. And yeah, a lot of other parts of Targon will need some love. I will do one hot take here, though. I think Targon is going to increase in popularity and play rate because it actually has... It's about the only region that can deal with Lost Soul super effectively, because Equinox exists, Hush exists, and then you have cards like Sunburst, which can be tagged to deal with Nami, with Sion, removing the second part as well immediately. So I think people are starting to pick up again on Targon, just because they are so versatile that they also have effective answers to many of these threats. But one thing that stands out, it couldn't quite keep up on mana efficiency. Yeah. So I think the biggest problem of the region.
Yeah. And that's kind of the whole thing with Invoke, is kind of losing tempo early to gain advantage later, but then there's no later now because everything's so fast, so it has problems with that, obviously. And overall, I think that the level it's at is, I think, lower than it should be. I think it should be around where Freljord is, because Lee Sin's always still a thing. Sparklefly, Guiding Touch, Pill Cascade, the whole Nami Zoe package is always still. And it's, I think, it's this kind of perception issue where a lot of streamers and content creators in the community kind of goes very far in one direction, and then it stays in the mind of everyone. It's like, oh, this is a laughing stock because of these nerfs and everything, where it's really not as bad as it seems. There's just no incentive to experiment there or to play because other things make more sense. And we've seen it before with other regions and other surveys, so I think it's a similar thing. But I do think it still has suffered from this issue, like you said, the same package being played all the time. I think it needs, kind of like Ionia and Demacia as well, this whole looking at all the cards that aren't being played at all, and trying to find a way to make them fit. I think the Nightfall card as well within Targon, because Nightfall's not an archetype, it also doesn't make sense, etc. So overall, something has to be done, I think, about Targon. But definitely don't revert all the nerfs to the very OP card, because that was correct. The problem was there was no balancing of bad cards or other cards, other deck diversity cards, to kind of keep the region the same or kind of a playable power level still.
I completely agree with everything you said, and the thing I want to point out is what you said about the different opinions between content creators and tournament players and so on, and the majority of the player base. I think Targon is the highest skill cap region, probably. It requires a lot of planning, a lot of early decision making, and thinking multiple turns ahead, and therefore it's always going to be perceived weaker by all the players up to the platinum or diamond level. And from then on out, Targon gets an increase in power spike just because it's played better.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think that's it for the power level. I think we took a lot of time here, but there's a lot to talk about. Check out really quickly just the numbers for Thematic Satisfaction. We have Bandle City. It's very strong right now, but also people like it a lot. I'm not surprised. I think it's a very fun region. It has a lot of very interesting cards, fun cards, and overall feels good to play, although maybe it's not as diverse as it could be. But I think that's more due to lack of experimentation and more just tunnel visioning on Bandle Tree and stuff like this, and not so much the region itself being devoid of certain things. And of course, it just came out, so maybe in the future we'll have obviously more options as well and more cards being added. Piltover Zaun, not surprised to see it in a very good place. We talked about it. It feels very complete now. It feels like it's been fleshed out completely in so many different ways. Bilgewater, to some extent, the same. Although I'm surprised to see it so high. I think the diversity isn't so diverse, but it's, I guess it is a bit surprising. That's not really what I expected. Shadow Owl's still very strong, and in the Thematic Satisfaction, despite its power level having gone down, I still think it's going to always be a fan favorite, just with the flavor of it, the lore, the champions, the spells. It just feels good for someone that wants to play that kind of symbolism, I guess you can even say. Just, I don't know, it feels cool to play. It's always been that way. It's always been a staple for a reason. Noxus, the same, very strong, but also pretty diverse in its options. Especially, and just new archetypes, Sion being added in as an option. Swain still, I think, not seeing as much play as it could be seeing, as it's seen in the past, but I think it's still viable now with Targon not being so played, so I think it's definitely helped there. Shurima, been fleshed out now with Xerath and Ziggs, and just all the new champions and old archetypes or sub-archetypes now making a lot more sense, like landmarks, for example. So it makes sense. And then we have these four on the bottom that we've talked about in the power level, and they all have problems with the region being too pigeonholed into a few cards and a few archetypes and a few of the same stuff that's been happening for the past 6 months because either nerfs have been made that shouldn't have been made, like Dancing Droplet, either because they've been outclassed and outshone by other new regions or new decks in terms of control, like Freljord, and Demacia. Just it's always been a problem for Demacia, I think. Nothing as much has changed in that regard, and Targon due to the recent nerfs, I think, as well.
We can see that a lot of these thematic satisfaction scores are fairly close to the power level perception scores. I think main reason for that is that the stronger the region is, the more playable decks you have, the more versatility you have in deck building, and the more, different mechanics you can try, and therefore are thematically satisfied. I think it correlates a lot. The ones I find interesting is the ones where there is a bit of discrepancy, and I think, like, for example, looking at Noxus, it's significantly higher in power level, and I think the reason is that Lost Soul and the Ravenous Flock package, like the discard and the Ravenous Flock package is everything that's being played in Noxus, and exactly those are super strong. But there's not that much variety, there's not that much versatility, and therefore the satisfaction is a bit lower than the power level. And we can say the same about Demacia, just as we mentioned earlier, always the same cards being played. Whereas in a region like PNZ, which ranks very highly, it's the exact opposite. Like, nothing is really overtuned. Most of the decks are tier 1.5, tier 2, let's say. But there's a lot of versatility, a lot of options of building, a lot of mechanics to play around with. Same with Bandle City with a new Prag mechanic. And I think this kind of explains why the graph looks fairly close to the last one, but some of these key regions do have differences from the power level.
And I do think Noxus compared to Demacia, at least in my experience and in my opinion, is more fun to play, or at least I enjoy it more from the decks I can build, the feeling of the decks, Draven, etc. Very strong, yes. Have been around for a long time, yes. They should have seen maybe at some point nerfs. Draven, Flock, Sentry, that whole package, and now Sion coming in as well. But overall, I think it's always been a fun play pattern and strong with Draven, Ezreal, now Draven, Caitlyn, but always in the kind of fair range. No one has ever really been seeing, put Draven, Ezreal, Draven, Caitlyn now in the spotlight as like the most broken deck. Sion, yes, maybe to some extent, and some of the new discard package card as well. But these, like, the board controlling and like fair outgrinding decks, I think have always been one of the best things in Runeterra with Draven, Ezreal. And I'm happy that Draven, Caitlyn is also now very strong, because I think it's definitely a great thing for the game. But I agree that some cards have been staples for too long, even though the champions have changed around a bit, and the general other cards that accompany them have had more diversity and more depth than Demacia decks and Ionia decks. And the strategy isn't so single-minded as like either Dragon or Rally. It's a bit more diverse, but there are some staples that do, I think, drag down the rating quite a bit here in this graph. But I think that wraps up the satisfaction rating. I think we shouldn't talk about this too much, or else this video will be very long. But let's move on to top 15 champions in the game at the current moment. This is what the community has decided as the strongest champions. Quick change that you might have noticed on the graphs, I've now started at 1 and not at 0, which is something that was pointed out to me as something that should be more accurate, because the lowest possible score is 1. So this is actually a more accurate graphic representation of the results. In this case, Sivir and her out of nowhere, no one asked for it buff has put her at 4.30. She's been cracked open and solved with Demacia and the general interaction and play patterns. Even with Rune Runner being nerfed, we saw it in the qualifiers, how strong that was in the right hands. I think the skill cap, similar to Targon, has made that deck extremely strong in what it can do and what it can get away with for the mana and the spells it plays, just because of the full package with Auction as well. And just overall, I think that is, and Sivir is obviously one of the main culprits in that deck, so I'm not surprised to see her as the highest rated champion, even though she's maybe not the most played champion by any margin, and maybe not the best champion if not in the right hands, because I think Akshan, Sivir, Demacia is a very hard deck to play properly, similar with Targon. But yeah, very, very happy to see her at the very top, because I don't know where her buff came from to put her at 30 instead of 35 for the level up, and just overall how things have evolved with new cards being added and Akshan being added around Sivir has made her very strong. Nami also, very high up there. I think let's just talk about a champion and then move along and talk about each one I think is better. So just Sivir, what are your general thoughts?
I'm actually happy the community still perceives her as very strong, because she definitely deserves that.
Good job, community.
Even though Sivir Akshan, like, after the nerfs is not played as much on ladder anymore, people still realize that the card itself is super, super strong just in a vacuum. It's easy to pair it with good like other good cards, therefore making a super good deck. It's a fair score. I do agree. Akshan is fairly high up there as well, so a lot of people did still have that deck in mind, but it's mainly Sivir that is really just a powerhouse in a vacuum right now.
Then we have Nami. I think her case is a very specific deck and a very specific overtuning of how much just value she adds to the board. How people were able to very quickly find a way to kind of break her and level up on turn 4, which is just extremely powerful for turn 4. Her effect when leveled up with double trouble and then banking the spell mana, etc., will solve very quickly. And similar to Sivir, I think once these champions are solved and once you're able to find the optimal way to abuse them or abuse their power, the power level is just extremely high. Whereas in the wrong hands, in an inexperienced player, deck builder's hands, isn't a champion that by itself takes over the game, but when the best players crack it open, they make the net decks, they pass it all day long, then it will become a meta-defining card, and it is a meta-defining card, similar to Sivir in that extent. Very strong drop, and I think definitely can see a nerf to maybe the stats added after she levels up to +1/+1 maybe, or a way, I think a tuning at 8 instead of 7, the level up would slow it down by a turn, which is, I think, crucial as well. Definitely a nerf will be coming, I think, on October 20th for this card because it is very overtuned.
I'm almost, not almost. I'm actually surprised that the card rating is not much higher. I would have expected at least a 4.5. I think it's by far the best card in the game. It's not only already too strong, but will be even stronger the more cheap spells get added. I think it's not only playable in one deck, just people quickly figured out that Zoe, Nami, Targon is the best version. And as you could see over the course of the week that the win rate of the average ladder player drastically increased with that deck, as it is very hard to play, but once people figure it out, the win rate just increases dramatically. And I think the Bandle City splash is also very strong. The PNZ splash, the Shadow Isle splash are all very strong. They're a bit overshadowed by how strong Targon as a pairing is. I do think Nami is in a bit of a situation with the 52% is your Aurelia meme that we had once. The meta already revolves around her, and she still has among the highest win rate, and it's gonna probably continue to rise. And I think if you give it 2 more weeks, the number would also be much higher in this balance patch survey.
Especially once, I'm not gonna say bad players, but players that aren't at a very, very high level learn to properly play the deck, because I think it's a deck that has some things you have to keep in mind. Every time I see someone playing Zoe turn 1 against me, I'm just like, okay, great, I win the game, or I have a much higher chance of winning because they're playing the deck wrong. Especially against a deck I don't know, I'm playing Fizzvi that has group shot and has removal on what are you doing playing Zoe turn 1? Even in Diamond or Masters, it just doesn't make sense. So once people, like with Sivir Akshan, once the best players in the world optimize the list, optimize the play patterns, and players that maybe aren't as not bad, because it's not bad, just not the best of the best in the world that can really crack this open very quickly, then it will become much worse. Once average players learn to play it at a high level, it'll become even worse than it is now, because I think it is a hard deck to play, like Aphelios was to some extent when he came out as well. Let's move on now to the package here of Noxus powerhouses, Sion and Draven. Sion, I think, much more of a precise and obvious thing. He's just very strong. His effect with the rally after the death, with you either stun him and there's really no way to deal with him dying. You have ways to kill your own Sion even, and just mixed in with the whole discard package has clearly come in way too overtuned. Not so much the stat, but the effect. The rally effect after death means that you can't think about killing him. You can't think about, it just limits the interaction to very specific things. And I think that creates very polarized matchups with either have many morph, or you have a stun, or you're going to be in big trouble on turn 7, no matter what your game plan is, no matter how well you control the early to mid game.
Yeah, you nailed it. Sion is pretty much one of those cards where you either have an answer that completely takes care of him and flips the matchup in your favor, or you don't, and Sion just overruns you. There's not much that can deal with a 7 mana 10/6 overwhelm that spawns a 10/4 rally overwhelm. If you don't have any mini morph hash type or stun, anything along those lines, most of the time you lose the game after Sion hits the board. You can't really. It's hard to outrace the deck before because they also have that much board presence. It's a bit of a tricky archetype to play against. I do think the play pattern is fun. It just creates pretty polarized matchup tables, which I'm not sure is long-term healthy for the game.
And the answers are very polarized as well. If you have a stun,
Exactly.
then all of a sudden, turn 7, do nothing, that's stunned, and the next attack token turn you're in trouble probably. And the early to mid game, so much damage is coming through that you cannot contain. Reborn Grenadier, Fallen Rider, Boom Baboon with Chump, etc. It just makes it very difficult to mitigate enough damage in the early to mid game, and then you have to get excited always. If you survive and able to get some big brain block with a big health unit, you're still gonna die to get excited next turn and there's just discard outlets. Just overall, it's just been overtuned with all the new cards. Sion and the whole package came in extremely strong throughout many different cards, and yeah, it's definitely a problem. I think Draven 3.9. By far the highest that a small and unassuming 3-mana quick attack champion has ever been. Nothing, every champion has always been at this rating or higher, has always done some crazy thing, but Draven is just very consistent. And then again, with the new discard cards added is what really, I think, broke him.
I think we already talked about that earlier on in the thematic satisfaction rating, that Draven got stronger because of the new cards being added. He was always an enabler. Now he enables really crazy stuff. I think he's still fine right now. There's a good chance he might need a tweak in the future. The question is, do you want to tweak the enabler in the future or the payoff in the future? So maybe if not that many more crazy discard cards gets printed, like Lost Soul, like Fallen Rider and so on, then Draven is also fine, as he has been for a very long time.
Yeah, and Draven enables so many. I mean, now obviously the strongest thing is this Sion deck or Draven Caitlyn, but overall there's Draven Riven. There's so many things that acts as enable as a strategy. Discard or spells or cheap 0-mana spells that you can buy, for example, decks as well. So many different things that if Draven is nerfed, that would be a big problem. And he's also very hard to nerf because the way he's 3/3. If you make him a 3/2. See you later. That card is not being. I mean, it will really go really low in play rate because it'll be very easily removed. And overall, I think if you take away the axe coming in when he first spawns in, that's maybe the somewhat of a viable nerf. That also limits a lot of things and makes things very awkward, I think, for the deck. So I think we both agree that the payoff cards, the cards you're discarding, like Reborn Grenadier and Fallen Rider and Lost Soul, of course, are the cards that need to be looked at and possibly solved to get Draven back to a normal. Because I think in Draven Caitlyn, if they're not, I guess they're also playing Lost Soul, so it's kind of fucked still. But overall, how that deck used to play in the past with Ezreal, I've always been an advocate of it being healthy and fine. Let's move on to Poppy. I think briefly, because Poppy is very, again, like Sion, obvious in what she's doing and what she's doing very strongly, and that is enabling Bandle Tree decks and getting the payoff for the Swarm. And I think Poppy as a whole isn't the problem. I think her stat line, 3 health for 4 mana, she is vulnerable before attacking. I think she is intractable. I think she has a strong effect, but the biggest enabler is Mayor, and the board Swarm is happening before she comes down, and the rally decks as well, I guess to some extent.
I do agree. I will still say that Poppy is a must deal with target, though. Yeah. So it's polarizing, somewhat similar to Sion, but there's a lot more answers to it, because any Get Excited, Ravenous Flock, some Fumes, a lot of single combat Cataclysm, Concerted Strike stuns, and so on. Challengers can deal with Poppy more effectively before she snowballs, but even one attack with Poppy is often a snowball. So whether it's Poppy herself, I think Poppy is fine. It's more about the Swarm being so efficient that Poppy becomes a must deal once it hits the board immediately.
And the level up, I think, is also pretty strong. I mean, especially if you're building rally type decks, it's a very strong level up, and I think something can be looked at in terms of the numbers to maybe make that a bit less impactful. It does have to feel good to level her up, of course, because it's not easy, because she is vulnerable and you have to attack 3 different times. You have to rally and attack 2 different turns, but I still think it's maybe that would be one way to kind of like with the Misfortune nerf initially that got reverted. If you think you need to do a nerf to Poppy, I think that would be the way to do it, level 2.
That's one way to do it. I think it happens very rarely, just like you said. MF flips in the backline, and Poppy needs to get into danger, basically, into the danger zone to level. But that's an interesting idea. I mean, I guess you could tweak the level up, but I think you could also just tweak the swarming, and that passively makes Poppy a bit weaker.
In rally decks, though, Poppy Lulu, I think, is going to gain traction in the next week, the next 2 weeks.
Fair.
And I think it will become more evident. I think that the level 2 is maybe something that can be looked at as a way to balance. I think the current stat line, the current effect is correct and strong and but fair and makes sense thematically as well. But the level 2 maybe is looked at a bit. Akshan. I haven't played a lot of Sivir Nami. It's an archetype that spooks me. I don't like how it looks. I don't like how it plays. I don't like the play patterns at all. So I'm going to let you speak on this one because I know you've played it as a competitive player quite a bit in the past few months. So what is your opinion on Akshan? For me, as an outsider, let's say, he feels very, very strong in terms of everything he does.
Yeah, I touched on Akshan when we talked about Sivir already. The thing is, Akshan is not the card that carries the game on his own and is not as immediately impactful as Sivir is. But for a 2-mana card, he does insane amounts of stuff. So the new versions of Sivir Akshan are more of an Akshan deck, just because the Spell Shielded Ruin Runner is not that common anymore. So it plays a lot more for the Warlord's Horde, or the second Akshan landmark, to go off and generate a lot of value. And it's really just, in that deck, you often play Akshan as a 2-mana 3/3 quick attack, which is already good. 2 cards and discount everything, or resummon a Ruin Runner, give everything vulnerable. I still think because he takes so much time until he reaches his full value, he's not really overtuned. I think it's one of the best champions design-wise that we have gotten. With he's strong, which you would expect from a champion. He can do a lot, but you still have so much time to interact with him that it's not immediately like, oh, whether or not you draw Akshan decides the game on the spot.
I think the champion's not the problem, but the Warlord's Horde and the effects it has and the way you can sharp sight and the Demacia pairing really makes it, I think, and again, even the Treasure Seeker and the sand, walking sands.
Walking sands, something like that. I
had fun with these cards that you see a lot, but you don't look at the name ever because they're just there as a 5/2.
The 5/2, yeah.
Yeah, ephemeral.
Yeah,
you can.
I think you can easily get the landmark to 9 or 10 cooldown, and Aksha would still be strong, playable.
Yeah, or even I don't know. I think obviously as a 2/2 quick attack, that's as vanilla as it gets, and Akshan the body himself and his effect is fine, but the Warlord's Horde is the problem. I don't know how you can balance this to make it slower, especially when you're again trying to break it and make it as unfair as possible with Demacia. To me, it just seems like, okay, this is too much stuff happening for a 2-mana drop. Where's Elise? Where's my Elise at? Summoning one little spiderling. where's the good old 2 drops from back in the day that were staples? But now Akshan does so much more, and it shows how the abstract power level and the abstract value things add to the game has gotten more complex, which I think is a good thing. But you have to control that complexity and try not to let it get too out of hand. And I think Akshan is an example of that power creep happening. Yeah, just too much. It doesn't seem like it's Akshan doing the Warlord's Horde stuff that's happening on turn 6 or 7, but it's him that's dropping on turn 2 and creating this, and that's the values coming from this card. So,
one last thing about Sivir Akshan is that the deck is currently being held back by Sion being so strong. As soon as Sion, if that is not a thing anymore, or you ban it in tournaments, Sivir Akshan is easily one of the top 3 or 4 decks in the game. And I think people kind of have lost track of how strong that really is.
Oh, I haven't.
That being said, I think Sivir is more deserving of some attention than Akshan, but you could definitely also look at both.
Going to Lee Sin, not so much play right now. Still highly rated because it is a very polarized and very annoying and very unfun champion to play against. And I think there's not much discussion to be made here. Not much has changed in his regard. The Dragon is maybe the card that should be discussed more. And the package around Lee Sin, the way the deck plays out and wants to play out, I think will always become an unfun thing regardless of the power level of certain cards, or Lee Sin himself. Just the way you end the games is just not fun for most people. So I agree with this rating, and it makes sense to me.
Exact same thing as with Sivir. I'm happy that people still perceive Lee as such a strong standalone card. Of course, it's weaker in the current meta because of more polarizing cards like Minimorph existing, Aloof Travelers hitting Lee Sin fairly often. But Lee Sin as a card on his own definitely deserves the rating.
Moving now to Senna and Viego, which I was very surprised to see at this rating. I don't know. I haven't played Darkest myself. I played against it. It feels strong in some matchups. Senna feels strong. I think she is quite strong as a champion itself, but I don't know if it's the 3.57, and I don't know if Viego's the 3. I didn't play much during the Viego meta. It was summer. I wasn't, as enthusiastic about the meta and the game itself during that time. But are you surprised to see the two champions rated so highly, or is it kind of a product of everything else under Lee Sin just being kind of going into mediocrity, with maybe Sejuani and Gangplank a bit lower than they should be? I think everything else. What's your opinion?
I think it's a bit of both. I think one of the reasons, again, is that we need to consider the whole player base and different skill levels. And I feel like both Senna and Viego do a lot if you give them the time to do a lot. And at lower ranks where people are not playing super efficiently yet, not even on the tempo decks, there's a much higher chance that you see the Viego level up. There's a much higher chance that you can play Senna and attack 5 times before the game ends and get 5 darknesses. I think that's part of the reason they both fell off in the competitive aspect. Senna is somewhat playable, Viego barely. But it's also a bit similar like Lee Sin. The cards on their own are strong. In the meta, they currently don't have a place, but maybe they will in the future.
For the next few champions, I think we're not going to go too deep into them because I think they're fairly obvious. Lulu, a byproduct of rally decks being very strong. Mm-hmm. I think she's not necessarily broken or unfair. It's just the cards around her. Lion's Pursuit, Young Witch, etc. Things like something like Lulu Jinx was very fair and very okay as a deck, but then Demacia came in and that changed a little bit. Azir, I'm not entirely sure what he's doing at 3.39 still. I think his play rate.
PTSD.
I was going to mention this when I was looking over the number. I'm going to actually just say it's PTSD. I think that's definitely the case. I think he doesn't deserve to be this high up. I think his current, after Azir got nerfed so much, I think he's fine, especially with the nerf he got as well. I think he can be closer to 3, which is kind of the healthy point to be at, but definitely a bit strange to see him this high up. Zoe, always been, I think, fine as a deck building reason to play Targon, as now obviously in Zoe Nami, very strong, but by far not the star of that deck. It is Nami and Sparklefly and Shelley instead, so more of a supporting role, and I think she's fine where she is. Ezreal, after his rework, has been, I think, a very one of the perfect examples of a great and viable champion in terms of deck building, in terms of power level, in terms of ending games, in terms of play patterns. Has always been alongside Draven. I think, even though Draven is now rated very highly due to the Noxus package that got added with this expansion, I think both are ideal champions and ideal examples of how a champion should be built in Runeterra. And then Sejuani and Gangplank in the Plunder deck, I think as well, like Ezreal, just good champions, good examples of how a champion should be built. A good win condition, a good level up, a good deck building cost with the Plunder, having to build around it. Just for me, some of the best champions in the game right now in terms of just the example they should be setting for design in the future as well, in power level, and just in a vacuum, where a champion should be at.
Yeah, I agree with you on most of these champions. They're fair, but have a potential high payoff. But you need to go there. Like, you need to go the distance to get that payoff. And many of them also have multiple deck building options. Like Sejuani could technically also be played in Frostbite midrange if that was a thing. Ezreal in different things. Like Azir can be played in Burn and other stuff. Yeah, most of them are versatile, not too strong, not too weak. Yeah, like you said, good examples of champions.
All right, let's move on now quickly to the bottom 15 champions. The bottom of the barrel, the ones that are struggling. And now, because the graph starts at 1, this is that much sadder. Usually it started at 0 and you would think, oh, that's not that bad. They have a pretty big bar. But in this, bar measuring contest, it is a sad state of affairs. And we see Katarina and Lux leading the pack. And that is not a good thing. Obviously,
probably trailing the pack rather, right?
Trailing very far behind. Katarina has, I don't know, in this race, she's broken her leg or something because she's been behind for the entirety of the race in Runeterra's history. And just overall a champion that to me has never really made sense. Her champion spell has never made sense with her, and just the power level with things around her have eclipsed, by multitudes what she can do and how she feels to play in the game. And Yasuo not being good also doesn't help with the whole, and recall, of course. I mean, she's kind of a recall champion to some extent. Not working is also not great. So Lux and Katarina, big problem. And by far, maybe alongside something like Aphelios and Echo. I think Echo's also in a very, very bad state in terms of how he was designed and how the packages surround him, I think, to some extent. Do you agree with that?
I mean, there's not much to say, honestly. All of these could be buffed for sure. Of course, like, people are slower to address the less played champion than the most played champion because that's more urgent. But stuff like Katarina is like what could have been addressed for a long time. It's about time they finally get some appreciation and love, because Riot always did say one of their goals is to make every champion playable and also to include every champion in the game, right? And with everything up to like Yasuo, I think Aphelios is hard to buff in a way, but everything else I think could be taken a look at, either get some stat buffs or a slightly rework to their effects.
Yeah. Other champions I think are somewhat fine in a vacuum, Diana and Nocturne, as champions themselves without taking into account their archetype and the reasons to play Nightfall even. I think they're fine. They're strong champions when they do their thing, and Nocturne levels up and they have a strong effect, and Diana as well as a controlling tool, but just Nightfall has not found the right tools or not had the right reason to play it. A lot of the champions can also be just the incentive to play them. We saw the example when we did this analysis a few months ago with Blom Vladimir, and that coming into the meta, and the jump, and now Vladimir and Braum have both gone down back to where they were, even though not much has changed. I mean, some things have been power crept, of course. Maybe it's not the greatest deck in the meta, but overall power level is the same, and they've gone down the perception like 0.70. So some of this is perception and some of this is support not being there. Some of this is just Garen being power crept, being very vanilla, not really having much going for it. Heimerdinger needs, I think, some kind of a rework or a stat buff. His stats are way too low for the cost he's coming in at, comparing to Veigar, comparing to Azir when he came out, for example, like these back row engine champions, I think. But hey, Heimerdinger is a very strong effect, for example. Leona, daily package, very reduced in what it can do and very precise as an archetype, and not really, I think it's missing supporting cards, even though the champion itself is not really necessarily bad, Leona. Maybe the level up is a bit of a problem, or I don't know, the play pattern of like stunning or like daybreak, I don't know, just how it plays out is a bit awkward, I think.
Yeah, you were saying a lot of these were lacking the right support. I just want to call some of those champions out. Yasuo, for example, stun package just not good enough. Leona, daybreak package not good enough. Echo, predict package not good enough. And then you also mentioned some are power crept, or let's say some are too slow. Tryndamere is just coming down too late to matter. Braum, I guess, got power crept. There are some followers that are better. Some of the other champions that see play are just way more impactful. I find it funny that you include Diana as a Shadow Isles champion here in the colors. But I mean, I guess it does make sense, because Diana always only sees play with Shadow Isles, either in an atrocity control package or as a Nightfall champion. So therefore, for some of these champions, it's also that they're predetermined into the packages, and the whole packages just aren't strong enough. And the Nightfall package is one example there.
And for Yasuo, like you mentioned, I think it's a very strong card. It's a card that devs are scared about breaking by enabling it too much with certain supports, but a Yasuo boat, one drop like Draven has, would go a long way, I think, in helping that archetype be consistent. And more staple stun cards like Concussive Palm and Sentry, maybe not as strong as Sentry, for example, but just more cards that make more sense aside from like Steel Tempest and stun cards that are just laughably bad in just a power level vacuum that don't make much sense regardless of Yasuo being there or not. It is a hard one to balance. I think the devs have a challenge with that, and they don't want to break him, because I think it is a very strong effect what he has and it's a cool effect. It's a effect that people would like to play, as we see with every new stun card being added to the game, people thinking about Yasuo and Mogwai trying to build a deck and etc. This is a card and an effect and a flavor that people want to play, and so I think it is dangerous. It is a bit risky to enable that too much, but come on. It's been a year and a half now. Give us one good stun card. Every card that's added is like, I don't even consider deck building for it. And I build some pretty stupid decks because it's just so obviously not going to work out in most cases. So yeah, something that I think can be fixed in the future. But a lot of these champions, I think, definitely will see a better day, hopefully, in the future. But let's move on now to the controversial card ratings for this latest expansion. And we'll go quickly. We see a lot of Bandle City. We see a lot of Noxus. We see a lot of Ionia and Demacia, as we talked about. Kind of pretty obvious, no Shadow Isles, because we mentioned it's been power crept a lot. Freljord, the same except for Troll Chant. Targon, the same except for Equinox. So very clearly reflects the power level of the regions in the cards as well, with very few outliers in this case, like Shelley for Bilgewater. But let's quickly go over just the top ratings here. Bandle City Mayor and Aloof Travelers as the two most broken cards in the game. I wouldn't necessarily agree with these being the top two. I think they're definitely in the top 10. I think not top two. I think this is a mix up between Reddit and general player base ratings of what feels unfun to play against, what feels the play rate's very high for Bandle City Mayor, for example, over what's actually the most broken thing or the most unfair thing in the game right now. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, absolutely. This is about perception of the community. If you run into this a lot, you perceive it as stronger. If you play against aloof travelers and you build your meme deck and they discard your treasure trash, you feel like it's too strong. And I think that has partially stuff to do with it. I don't think aloof travelers' power level is insanely high. It's just frustrating to play against. Bandle City Mayor is a bit trickier because he is fairly easy to protect with cheap combo tricks, and definitely a strong card. I think Bandle City Mayor deserves a rating somewhere around there, but I feel like some other cards just have a much lower rating than they deserve. And I think one of the more interesting ones in this expansion is actually Lost Soul.
Yeah.
What's your opinion there, Panda?
I agree. I think in terms of if you asked the best players in the game and the brightest minds in Runeterra, in their perception, that's where there would be some dissonance between the different, and it's expected. It's not necessarily, the average player base being. It's just, again, like I said, this is a perception of balance, not balance in a vacuum. Like, these are the three strongest cards by win rate. It's just perception, so it's important to highlight that. So I think Lost Soul is just, it's not as intuitive, the value he gets, but in terms of in Draven Caitlyn and Draven Ezreal and in Sion decks, the amount of hand value and just eternal value you get with these cards, the infinite value in the right deck, is something that we don't see very often in Runeterra. It's a very, very strong effect, and yeah, it makes it a very strong card, even though it's not like, oh, a 4-3 challenger. This is not that broken. But once this card becomes, I think once a month passes, then it's going to be more clear for maybe the less experienced players or players that aren't as good at just highlighting and like seeing a card and saying, oh, this is the value it has, this is why it's so broken. It's not as intuitive for some players, and that's normal, I think, for a card like this. But after some time, it will become more clear, I think, definitely, why it's so broken.
I agree, and I think people are now only starting to realize to play 3 of Lost Souls in almost every Noxus deck. The thing is, it does so much. It helps the deck at so many angles. It is infinite value, literally infinite. Then it makes your other cards better, the discard cards that require discard fodder as a cost. But this one actually benefits from being discarded because you get a unit at basically no tempo cost. Yeah. 4 mana 4/3 is not even really overpriced.
And a good unit, like a challenger unit.
Yeah, a challenger. And that's important as well. Yeah, it gives you additional board control, which is also equivalent to tempo. So you have a good tempo card that also generates infinite value. And I think people will only slowly start to realize this over the course of the next few weeks. But one thing I will say, opposed to something like Nami, Lost Soul is more interactable. I mentioned it earlier, Equinox Hush, Obliterates, and transformation effects like Minimorph. The issue is, again, polarization. It's literally only 2 regions that have effective answers to Lost Soul.
And not even effective. I think Minimorph, obviously for 6 mana, is not maybe the cleanest answer to a 4 mana play, let's say. So it's not tempo effective, it's not value effective in that sense, so it is still tricky. Sion, for example, yes, he gets countered by Minimorph because it costs 7 mana, so it's kind of the whole turn on turn 7, and you can stop that directly. Whereas if you're worried about Minimorphing Lost Soul, you're going to have a bit of a surprise on turn 7 when Sion comes down, and you don't have a Minimorph in your hand anymore. So, and you've lost that tempo trying to fight against Lost Soul when you have to deal with Reborn Grenadier hitting you across the side, Summon Dredger still, Boom Baboon, etc. Like it's accumulation of things that make Lost Soul even more problematic, I think. Shelley, I think we won't go into it too much. I think it's fairly obvious why this card is so broken, and we're kind of on a time constraint here.
Yeah, similar to Nami. That's basically
talked about it. Similar to Nami, same problems in that one deck, and can probably become a problem in other decks in the future as well, just because it's a very strong effect.
Just one thing I will say about Shelley and Nami both together is that the issue with them is even if they get removed, you still have the action to buff, like to dumpster your whole mana into efficiency. So even if Nami gets removed immediately, outside of Burst Spell, because there's Minimorph is overpriced, there's no efficient way to deal with her at burst speed. At fast speed, you can still get like 4, 5, 6 buffs off of her. Yeah. And then you pay 3 mana for like 10/10 in stats.
And the pool of burst and fast speed cards that are playable in that kind of archetype, in that kind of very cheap spell thief, etc., is big enough now that it's a problem, that it's very consistent to build a deck without having to pay any additional cost by playing bad cards, let's say. Burblefish obviously giving you usually kind of burst speed cards. Like it's just accumulation of things that make it very strong, obviously. I have a dragon, Twin Disciplines. Well done, community. I have a dragon almost at 4. Next time I want to see her at 4.0, and then we really made it. Can definitely see a nerf. I think it's been around for a long time without getting any nerfs. I think 2 health would be appropriate for a 2-drop that has a very strong effect, or some kind of nerf has to happen, I think, to have the dragon. Even though Lee Sin is not the most popular thing right now, and Ionia control also isn't. It's not so much about the power level of the dragon, which is very high, but the constraints it creates in Ionia in terms of building a control shell. You're not going to think about anything else, so it eliminates the competition of like diversity for deck building in the region as well, which is I think is a very bad thing compared to Brightstone Protector. Also the same. Community, you failed me. Brightstone Protector did not make it into this list. I want better results next time, but again, not as obvious why it's so broken, but it's been around in the Demacia shells for a long time for a reason as well. Twin Disciplines, very strong, but especially within Ionia and within what Ionia is trying to do with things like Eye of the Dragon, for example, as a protection spell. Same with Targon with certain spells. It really shines in that region. And because it's +3 stats, which comparing to Sharp Sight, it's +4 stats. Comparing to Troll Chance, +4 stats, let's say. It's obviously different. The +3 is a big reach in health or in attack, in aggressive or in defensive strategies. But overall, I think the card's not super broken. I think it was fine to make this card a very strong staple in Ionia.
Yeah, I agree with almost every deck. In Lee Sin, it might be overtuned because the optionality is insane. It's either +3 on your hyper carry in the early game, which is Eye of the Dragon, or +6 because of Overwhelm on your finisher, that is Lee Sin. Apart from that, yeah, absolutely agree. You basically have the optionality at the cost of having one more stat total than Sharp Sight gives. Seems fine.
Talking about Sharp Sight, 3.93 rating. I think this is a card that, especially the way it is created with the extra effect of blocking elusive, which is something that maybe doesn't come up that often, but usually when cards have an extra effect, there's a trade-off in the numerical value of because it has this extra effect, this abstract value of blocking elusive, so it's not going to give you, let's say, the full value of what a 2-mana burst speed staple card does. But Sharp Sight decides to give you +2/+2, which I think is very fucking strong, has been very fucking strong for a long time, and has enabled rally decks and has enabled so many things in Demacia. And yeah, overall, I think it definitely can see some sort of a numerical change if it's going to keep, and I think it should keep the elusive blocking capabilities because it allows for interaction, it keeps elusive at bay to some extent, but there should be a trade-off here, I think, in value. Like there's usually, this is just a +2/+2 for 2 mana it's very high, I think.
Mm-hmm. At the same time, you would probably need to make other Demacia cards better to make up for this. But yeah, that would help against the problem of centralizing Demacia onto this card, onto the couple of cards that are really strong in Demacia.
Sharp Sight, Brightstone Protector, Concerted Strike, can all see.
Fleet Feather Tracker, we forgot earlier on.
Can see some changes with, like we mentioned with Targon, got changed, and nothing got buffed, and that was a problem. This is something that has to, be done differently with Demacia, but I think something has to be done about the diversity of options inside that same region because it's clearly a problem. Then we have Minimorph, Otterpuss, Bandle Tree. In a vacuum, strong cards. I think because the play rate and power level of the region is so strong for Bandle Tree or for Bandle City, they're going to be very strong. I think Bandle Tree is fine. It has interaction with landmark removal. It's a lengthy process, I think, to some extent. I wouldn't really change nothing about the card or about Minimorph. I think both are fine. Otterpuss, we talked about 1-drops paying for themselves with a tune as a problematic thing. And Prank, of course, will be talked about here as well. I think the +2 cost Prank effect is very strong. I think because you never even consider anything else, it shows how strong it is. And I think something has to be looked at as well, not just with Otterpuss, with the Prank card itself and that maybe being a +1 cost or maybe not affecting mana cost at all and affecting instead more of a prank type of thing, more like, oh, you have no attack now if you're Zap Strafen. Oh, this happened, but more of a prank and not like a huge weakness to the card you have in hand.
Yeah, first of all, Minimorph and Bandle Tree, I do agree. I think the rating comes from being frustrated by playing against that card. Like, it's making your fun win condition like disabling your farm win condition and Bandle Tree sometimes being hard to interact with. Otterpose actually deserves to be there, maybe even deserves to be higher. It was a very like a 3 of auto include in any Bandle City deck for a while. It can still be one. Super efficient, takes out your opponent's tempo. Yeah, the prank thing could be reworked. Another option would be to, well, actually we'll get to prank later on, right?
And with Otterpose as well, there's the fact that, again, it falls into the strategy of chump blocking for eternity, and for really you're not paying any price at all. You're playing as one. I mean, the having the one drop
0 mana 1/1.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. It's way too valuable, and the card it generates is very, very strong as well with prank. So yeah, definitely something that has to be looked at. Young Witch falls into the rally. Same thing we talked about already with Rally and Demacia and Ionia. Troll Chant, Freljord, it's going to stay that way. I think it's a strong card that fits. Flock, a card that I think has more debate for it. I think can definitely maybe see a change to 2 mana.
Flock is really hard to change. So any tweak you do to a number by 1 is super significant.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, but maybe it's 3 damage. It's hard because of the unit being damaged already. Then it's 3 damage. Like it's a big kind of disparity in what damage you can do. But overall, I think it's been a stable for too long, and it's maybe a bit too efficient for Noxus as a whole, and that's why we see Noxus being so strong right now. Treasure Seeker as kind of a surprise hit. Very strong card for what it does. Again, similar to Otterpus of generating a card in hand that you wouldn't play otherwise, but when it's generated, it becomes very good, especially when you can break it kind of with Sivir and Nami in that deck, and with just an aggro deck as well. It's just a very, very strong card, I think, for 2/1 effect, and for maybe the effect of the Waking Sands, I think is the name, should go down to 4 attack maybe. We've seen it before with Curse Keeper and that package kind of being nerfed in that way.
It's tough with reputation though.
Yeah. But I mean, is it being played in reputation? Does reputation exist? What is reputation, Lobster? I forgot.
Yeah, that's tricky. And that hits a lot of cards. It also hits like the Akshan landmark. It hits some other cards spawned as 5/2 as well, like that 5 mana landmark that no one plays, but like there is collateral damage. Treasure Seeker is interesting. I'm actually glad the community perceives this as so strong because it's not immediately game breaking, but just like consistent and strong, kind of like Otterpus is.
Karina Mastermind, very strong card in Teemo decks, very strong as a finisher. I think fair. There is the idea of it triggering the traps but not taking them out of the deck. It's a finisher. Should there be a trade-off for trying to finish the game in this way? I think not. I think it's fine as it is. I think it's strong as it is. I think Teemo Caitlyn is never going to be the strongest deck in the meta, but finds its place. It's fun to play, and maybe in some matchups it will be annoying, but that's how it is. It has to have those good matchups against certain control decks that are slower, that don't play for that kind of. It's an alternate win condition to some degree, kind of like Tonkin Soraka and other decks, but I think Karina Mastermind is a fitting finisher and a strong card, but not anything super broken. Golden Aegis and Rally, we can talk about together.
Yeah, just about Karina.
Yeah.
Let's be honest here, we're both a bit biased. We both love trap decks, but I do agree. I think trap decks were a meme for too long. They needed a strong finisher. They've gotten one. It's not overpowered. It's not pushing the archetype over the top. Seems fine.
Golden Aegis and Pursuit.
Yes.
I am, I'm not a big fan of these cards and the play patterns they enable. I think, again, the cards themselves aren't broken. It's everything around them. It's what you can abuse with them. And new cards have been added or have been reverted, the nerfs with Young Witch and Twin Disciplines, etc. That makes breaking these cards very easy because of the effect staying for that round. So when you Twin Disciplines once, you have it twice. Sharp Sight again as well. The rally effect, of course, is just it limits design space in the sense that if other cards around it are broken, then it will seem very broken. I think right now it's not broken in the sense of it being the strongest thing in the game, but it creates very polarized matchups and very polarized situations where you shouldn't be honestly taking that much damage on turn 4 and 5 in certain matchups just because you queued into rally by accident on ladder. Do you agree with this sentiment?
Yeah, I could absolutely see them get +1 mana eventually. 4 mana Rally and 5 mana Aegis, but similar to Sharp Sight, at the same time, everything else in Demacia needs to be a bit stronger on average. And that equalizes the power level overall, but it makes this play pattern less frequent, less frustrating to play against, and less abusive of certain effects that benefit super hard from attacking again.
Yeah, I agree. With Poppy as well is another example.
Perfect.
Next package we're looking at here is Fallen Rider and Reborn Grenadier. Very much more intuitive than Lost Soul as to why these cards are very strong right now. no loss of value with a discard. They enable discard that normally is a big loss of value. Used to be before when you were deck building with Rummage, with Get Excited, with Draven, you had to be very precise in your deck building. Now you don't. Now you just put these cards in that don't lose any value on discard, and you just keep going your merry way, spamming a lot of damage on the board very quickly and very high tempo. So definitely problematic cards in terms of there not being any trade-off, I think.
Yeah, they're a gain of value to discard. That's the thing. Like, usually discard cards used to be a bit more efficient. Like, the discard cards had better effects. Like, for example, Get Excited is just straight up better than Gotcha or some Fumes, but it is only better because you have to discard a card. Yeah. But now you discard a card, so Get Excited is already better than average, and then you generate a card that's better than average.
Yeah, clearly
very strong.
The process was something went wrong, because like you're saying, there used to be a trade-off, there used to be a negative effect. Now it's a positive effect. So why wouldn't you just put in all these cards that give you discard value without any trade-off? So I think some amount of oversight in terms of how strong they are and how there's just no real weakness to the cards themselves. Revan Grenadier, even as a defensive option, instant blocker. I mean, Fallen Rider with Fearsome as a 4/2, as a 2-drop. I mean, very strong power level in a vacuum overall. Equinox, very strong card, has been a problem, and we've complained about it before with swing decks, etc. But I think now with Targon not being played very often, it's seemingly not as big of a problem. I still think it's a very strong effect for 1 mana. I still think it can be maybe capped to a certain mana cost of followers they can hit, or something can be done about it. But overall, right now with Targon's play rate, it's not going to seem like the strongest or the most broken card, but definitely a card that can limit a lot of certain archetypes and decks in the future with certain followers.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know what needs to be done. Maybe just a mana cost increase, but it's, again, is a card that generates a lot of polarization. It just renders stuff like Leviathan useless. It could render stuff like Lost Soul useless in the future. Not much more to add.
And the last card is Merciless Hunter. Still, despite the nerf, finding a spot here, finding a gift for Renekton in the very end of the controversial card ratings graph with a 3.51. I think it's now a strong strong, stable, effective card in what it does. Giving vulnerable to Ionia on turn 3 is very strong, controlling the board. But I think overall fair, and obviously doesn't need a second nerf or anything. Yeah. I think it's still fine.
That's the thing. Yeah, it's still an above average power level card. It's a strong card. It's how it should have been from the beginning. Yeah. It's not completely ridiculously overtuned. Yeah. It's interactable as well.
I agree. That will be it for this. We're going to look at the champions kind of in the middling spot, but I'm low on time and I have other things happening 4 minutes ago, so I'm going to be late. So that will be it. I think we've covered a lot. The video is, again, 1 hour and 40 minutes, so I think we can't make it too much longer. I will be going on Reddit, of course, alongside this video. We're doing a write-up, going more in depth with a lot of different things with my own opinions throughout this day today, and I'll be posting this in a few hours, so in the afternoon, evening time. So you guys will be seeing this, and we'll be able to see the write-up on Reddit as well. I should have mentioned at the start of the video, but I'll keep it in the description so you guys also know to check that out in tandem with this video. Thanks once again for watching. Thanks once again, Lobster, for joining me. Obviously having the insight and the opinions of someone that's so involved with Runeterra, and obviously one of the best players in the world, is obviously very helpful in being able to analyze things like this survey. So very grateful for you to join me for every one of these that I do. And I think that's it on our end. Anything else you want to add, Lobster?
Oh, just thank you for taking the time to do asking the community, actually getting them involved. And thanks for the viewers who actually did this survey. Without you, we wouldn't have the data here.
Yeah.
It's only possible because of you.
Thanks a lot for participating. And I will probably be doing one of these again in late October before the major balance patch. So we'll be double dipping just a month later or so. So yeah, good to look forward to that as well. And yeah, thank you once again, guys, for watching, for participating, for sharing the survey on Twitter, on Reddit, in your communities throughout the week. And hope you guys enjoyed the analysis from us. Goodbye.
Goodbye.